Thank you very much. I want tonight to talk about William James's theory, the will to believe, but I'll be talking about it in the context of certain notions about belief rather than in connection with any facts about William James himself as a person, although I will be mentioning certain facts about James's philosophy. Now, in the essay, The Will to Believe, James laid down a set of conditions under which, if we hold a certain belief, then we have a right to hold that belief. The set of conditions James lays down is exceedingly stringent because it's not James's intention to issue, as his critics sometimes have accused him of wanting to do, an unrestricted license for wishful thinking. That is to say, James is not suggesting anything like believe what you will or believe as you will. To begin with, the option to believe must, in James's pungent idiom, be a live option. That is to say, we must in fact believe, or must in fact have a strong inclination to believe, the proposition in question. That we should have a right to believe only if we do already believe, or at least have a strong impulse to believe, may appear curious, for it might seem as though rights are determined independently of what men are doing. That is to say, there are many things I have a right to do which I never exercise because I never do the things in question. And what's curious in James's discussion is that I have a right to believe only if I do in fact believe. As we'll see, however, that's very crucial for James's theory. Secondly, the option to believe must be a forced option, in this sense, that if I choose neither to believe nor to disbelieve, but rather, if I choose to suspend judgment even, to take an external stand, which in effect is to take no stand on the question at all, well then this is in certain cases, James argues, this is in certain cases tantamount to disbelief. Not to take a stand is in effect to take a negative stand. Not to believe is in effect to believe not. So an option is forced when, and only when, no neutral position is possible. And that again is a curious condition, largely because if there are no forced options, then James's theory has no application whatsoever, and it's at least arguable that there are no forced options. Finally, the belief in question must be momentous. It must make an immense difference in the universe if the belief in question is true or false. It must, in effect, be a vastly different universe depending upon whether the belief is false. It must finally make an immense difference to me whether the belief is true or false, for the belief, after all, is my belief. If, for example, I believe that it's raining in New Jersey now, it makes some difference to the universe whether or not that belief is true, but it doesn't make a vast difference. So, that is to say, it wouldn't be a vastly different universe depending upon which way it went. And so it can't vastly matter to me either whether it's raining in New Jersey or not, although it might matter to me some. So, to sum it up, if I in fact believe a proposition whose truth or falsity would indicate vastly different universes, then, if suspending judgment were the same as to suppose the belief in question false, I have a right to hold the belief in question, such is James's theory. There is however, one further condition which must be mentioned here. If I believe that it's raining in New Jersey, I can find out whether this is a true belief or a false one. It's not unreasonable to ask a man to suspend judgment pending the outcome of such an investigation. And I may ask a man, what is the urgency of believing one way or another? It's a matter only of making a phone call, asking somebody, and then you can believe as the evidence indicates. I don't say, again, that it wouldn't make a lot of difference to the man if his belief should go one way or the other, but only that the difference it might make would hardly be enough reason for him to believe one way or the other when the question is one which can be settled by routine means of factual resolution. James wished to exclude from consideration all questions save those which, and I quote, the intellect of the individual cannot by itself resolve, close quote. In other words, questions whose answer cannot be furnished by the routine methods of factual resolution. And I think it might be said that a proposition would be momentous. That is to say, it would be a vastly different universe depending upon whether the proposition in question were true or false, only if it were a proposition whose truth or falsity couldn't be settled by routine methods of investigation. With such propositions alone is James concerned to establish our right to believe them if we do believe them. For the price of holding belief at a distance is exactly the same as the price of the belief being false. If, for example, the belief in question is a religious belief, then the price of agnosticism is as great as the price of disbelief. But because of the urgency of such beliefs for those to whom there are live options, no such person should be under obligation to pay that price. So, to say that you are not obliged not to believe is equivalent with saying that if you do believe, you are entitled to do so. The price, in effect, is to live in a different universe than the one you want to live in. And if it's beyond our power to determine which universe we do in fact live in, the difference in our lives is sufficiently momentous to justify our living in that universe our belief chooses. If the option is not, however, a live option for you, it will not make a difference in the universe you live in, and there is no question to decide. But let me proceed cautiously at this point and provide some background for our thoughts about James's theory. For after all, James's theory is almost in its own terms an instance of what it sets out to describe. It would make an immense difference whether James's theory were true. For if James's theory were true, we would in effect be entitled to live in that universe which gave us the greatest comfort. And for those who suffer from the sort of cosmic malaise to which James addressed himself in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, James's theory itself would bring relief. We must not let ourselves forget that James was by training and profession a doctor. His writings have often a therapeutical intent. They are to be taken for those who are suffering certain spiritual ailments. The medicine of the will to believe is one we may be reluctant to swallow, but resistance to cure is not uncharacteristically part of the disorder when the illness is a spiritual illness. So let us attempt the sort of pre-therapeutic task of explaining this resistance. The question is whether James's anodyne is one we can take. Do we have a right to the right which James wants to confer? And does James have a right to confer it? Which is the same as to ask, is there a right to believe under the conditions James set down? Well, here I want to examine some of our beliefs about beliefs. And when I say our beliefs about our beliefs, I mean the beliefs about beliefs which I think we all share. Like our beliefs about actions, our beliefs about beliefs have a decidedly moral character. There are circumstances, thus, under which we feel that an action is obligatory, and that a man who, under those actions, under those circumstances, doesn't act as he ought to act, is derelict in his duty and subject automatically to blame. But so are there circumstances under which a man is derelict in his rational duties if he believes differently than, under those conditions, he ought to believe. And notice that not acting, when action is obligatory, is like not believing when belief is obligatory. It's equally derelict with acting differently or in believing differently. When actions and when beliefs are obligatory, we have an instance of a forced option in that suspension, either of action or of belief, must be counted as the same as a positive violation of duty. Now, of course, it's a violation only if you accept the code of action under which this is obligatory, or the code of belief under which this belief is obligatory. In other words, only if you subscribe antecedently to a code of action or to a code of beliefs are you in any way obliged to believe or to act in the way in which the code specifies. There are forms of skepticism, both of action and of belief, which constitute a stand virtually beyond morality, enjoining as an obligation that we suspend action as well as suspend belief. But in fact, to take that stand is only to make oneself subject to another code, because suspension of action is a form of action, as the Bhagavad Gita recognized. And to suspend belief because you feel you ought to suspend belief is implicitly to subscribe to a code in which you believe, namely, you believe that you ought not either to believe or disbelieve from amongst a given set of propositions. In brief, any rational stand beyond the morality of belief, or any rational stand beyond the morality of action, is exactly and ironically only a different moral stand. There is no rational position which is not, in effect, a moral position. And so rational skepticism, if I might put it so, skepticism with regard to rationality itself, is a curiously self-defeating position. So let's accept what we must and work within those confines, since no rational alternative is possible. Let me now distinguish between what sometimes would be called the causes in contrast with what would be called the reasons for an action, a distinction which has an exact analog in the domain of belief. A man may hold a belief because something caused him to hold it. He's been taught, for example, or indoctrinated, or perhaps he's been operated upon by some mad doctor who's implanted a belief in his system. Asked why he believes as he does, he may explain his holding that belief with just the same sort of explanation that would be appropriate were he to have been asked why he bears a certain scar. I say, I bear that scar because I suffered a wound. I say, I hold that belief because I was caused to hold it. He would simply indicate what caused him to have that belief. And in similar ways, men are caused to act. But an action is a rational action only if it's done for a reason. We might add a good reason. And a belief is a rational belief only if the believer has a reason for holding it. As rational agents and as rational thinkers, we are required, so far as we are these, not only to have reasons for our choices and our beliefs, but insofar as possible to act and to affirm in the light of some idea of what constitutes a good reason. Now here, explanation in terms of reasons involves not explaining a fact, namely that I do believe or that I have chosen, but constitutes a justification for having chosen to act or to believe. And in doing that, in justifying my belief, rather than merely explaining why I happen to hold the belief, I'm tacitly committed to a system which specifies duties and obligations in the domain of practice and theory. Now, of course, the world is such that we often have very little time to deliberate as to which course of action is the proper course, or which proposition is the fit proposition to believe. In view of the fact that we've survived at all, there is something to be said for simply yielding to a belief that you're caused to have. For it may be that we are caused in many and in perhaps most cases to hold just the beliefs we ought to hold, and that the beliefs that we're caused to hold are the very beliefs we would have held had we made a rational choice. If that were so, then there would be some prima facie justification for holding a belief. There would be some justification to be found for holding a belief simply in the fact that you do hold it. In the mass of cases, in other words, what is might coincide with what ought to be. In the mass of cases, one believes what perhaps one ought to believe. We might, in the general case, believe what, if we were rational, we would anyway have chosen to believe. Now, with that suggestion of a sort of pre-established harmony, which is analogous to the theory of a market mechanism, if you like, in economics, in classical economic theory, I have a certain measure of sympathy. But chiefly because I'm not certain that we can, in economics, follow, in general, a policy of laissez-faire. I don't believe either we can follow, in general, a policy of laissez-faire in the domain of belief or action. And so we have, from time to time, to interfere with the system and to disagree with beliefs which we might be caused to hold. Nevertheless, I think we all recognize that if we had to build up our systems of beliefs by rational accretions, in other words, if the only beliefs you held were beliefs which you, as it were, decided on rational grounds to hold, you might have a fairly impoverished set of beliefs. And in James's terms, we would perforce be living in a very different world than the one in which we do live, in consequence of the rather non-deliberate and spontaneous way in which we've come to believe what we've been caused to believe. For since a rational action is an action performed in the light of a rational belief, insofar as we believe our actions make a difference to the world in which we live, we're obliged to suppose that our not acting would make a difference as well. And the difference between acting and not acting in any given case is exactly the difference in the world which would be made by our decision only to hold what it's rational for us to hold, and the accumulation of such cases, which are many indeed, will in the end sum to rather an immense difference. Now, if we are pressed for some account of when we ought to believe a proposition, we would very likely introduce some notion of evidence. We might say, well, either it's rational to believe a proposition when the evidence for that proposition is of a certain strength, or when the evidence for that proposition is stronger than the evidence against that proposition, or when the evidence for that proposition is stronger than the evidence for some proposition incompatible with it, etc. Now, those are matters which are very much under contemporary debate in philosophy. It's a deep and difficult philosophical matter to determine under what conditions a proposition is acceptable. That is to say, which is the or which is a proper rule of acceptance for that proposition. And not merely that, but there's also considerable difficulty in knowing how we would apply such a rule, how we could tell when evidence had reached a certain degree of strength, etc., etc. Certainly, in common life, I believe we have very inexact notions of these matters, which would perhaps be another indication of the aggregate benignness of the system of causes under which our beliefs get implanted in us. But I think we all have a fairly strong intuition concerning qualitative attitudes having to do with those points beyond which it's no longer reasonable for a person to believe a certain proposition. It's of course true that we're seldom in possession of evidence which is going to force a certain proposition to come out logically false. And it's always possible with the evidence that we generally are able to get that the proposition is true, no matter how strongly the evidence seems to run against it. Yet, I think it would be reckless for a certain individual to continue to believe a proposition on the grounds that its truth is always possible when the evidence is running strongly against it, because that's simply to put yourself beyond the pale of evidence, since it's always possible, by and large, for a proposition to be true logically, no matter what the evidence is. So that constitutes simply a decision not to pay any attention to the evidence at all. And if you were to generalize that attitude, if you were to allow everybody that attitude, well, that would mean that anyone had a right to believe anything he wanted to believe, which, since that would mean simply anarchy in the domain of beliefs, is not something a rational man would wish. So a rational man would be obliged to suppose that there are points beyond which it wouldn't be reasonable for an individual any longer to hold a belief, though it would be logically possible that that belief should be true, however strong the evidence against it might be. So that you would, if you like, confess your irrationality by persisting in such a belief past that intuitively felt cutoff point, wherever that might come. Now, of course, there is a quality of courage in men who hold on to their beliefs when all the world seems arrayed against them. But for every rational martyr, there's a regiment of cranks, and that Columbus or that Galileo should have been right in believing propositions which might have appeared irrational at that time. Well, that's very slim grounds for endorsing any given present irrational belief, unless you have some better grounds that you're like Galileo or like Columbus than the mere fact that, like them, you hold beliefs which seem at the moment irrational. In the main, I think, mankind is quite justified in rejecting out of hand propositions which, because inconsistent with what appear to be well-supported beliefs, must, relative to those beliefs, be regarded as irrational to believe, and hence a matter of duty to disbelieve. Moreover, it becomes an extremely perplexing matter for us to understand how a man can in fact believe or persist in believing a proposition in the face of increasing contravening evidence. It simply is not in most of us to do that sort of thing, not because we lack courage, but, if I might put it this way, because of the structure of our minds. I mean, we often wonder how it would be psychologically possible for a man to hold such a belief. And we wonder whether he could continue in his heart, as we say, to believe as he claims he does. In other words, we spontaneously think that if he does protest that he believes it, he must in some way be insincere if he's not irrational. And I mention that because I want to emphasize that it's one of our beliefs about beliefs that men are generally caused to change their beliefs when they receive evidence of a certain strength. That evidence often constrains, evidence often coerces belief. The dialogues of Plato, with which many of you will be familiar, often show a man virtually being wrestled through argument and evidence out of an incorrect belief. And the effort is almost one of genuine physical exertion. Thrasymachus in the Republic is described as breaking into perspiration when he in effect concedes the crux to Socrates. He is a different man, almost, in consequence of having lost or surrendered his belief. He's a different person almost literally because his world is a different world in consequence of his belief having changed, because we, after all, refer our beliefs to the world. We don't refer our beliefs merely to ourselves as something which we, for our part, believe. We refer them to the world, for to believe a proposition is to believe that proposition true. And to say that it's true is to say that the world is one way rather than another. Now, one reason it's hard to give up beliefs is, I think, because we very often care about the way the world is. It means something to us that the world should be one way rather than another. And so it matters to us that we should believe one way rather than another. In other words, we are affected by more than simple rational considerations of evidential strength. We're driven by feelings and by concerns, and we have often to pay an emotional price for surrendering certain beliefs. In a general way, perhaps, we're obliged to care more about truth than about any given proposition being true, just as, in a way, we have often a greater commitment to morality itself than we have to any given action being moral. Nevertheless, it's very plainly true that it's part of being human that the content of our beliefs, and so the content of our world, given that we believe as we do, should matter. And with those considerations, we find ourselves on the borderlines now of Jamesian territory. The difference to me of a belief being true or false is the central concern of James's philosophy, or it is, if you wish, the irritant in response to which James's entire philosophy may be taken as generated. James wanted the difference to me to make a difference, and this led him to a theory according to which our care that a certain belief should be true might enter as a causal factor in making that belief true, in which case our passional nature would in effect not be an impotent outsider in the fabric of events, but would contribute to the pattern which was being woven. Now, let's perform at this point a kind of thought experiment. Let's imagine to ourselves a community of rational intelligences whose assent to a proposition would be exactly proportionate to the degree of evidence available to them. As that degree of strength, of evidential strength, should rise and fall, so should the degree of their assent. They would believe whatever they were obliged by the canons of rationality to believe, and disbelieve whatever they were obliged to disbelieve, and they would suspend judgment where neither belief nor disbelief were obligatory. They would be like weather vanes, turning obediently with shifts in the wind, automatic and mechanical indicators of the shifts and directions in the current of evidence. In such a world, changes in evidence would mean changes in belief. There would be no resistance to change, and indeed the distinction between causes and reasons would collapse. Every cause of a belief would be a reason for a belief, since the only causes allowed would be rational causes, that is to say, matters of evidence. There would then be no causes for believing what it was not rational to believe. The inhabitants of that imaginary community would always do what they ought to do and would never do what they ought not to do. The morality of belief would constitute, if you wish, the laws of nature for that community of pure rational intelligences. It would be very like Kant's categorical imperative in the domain of rational belief having come true. Now, suppose we tried to use the laws of nature for that community of pure rational intelligences as the moral system which specifies our duties with regard to belief. Duties which we know we ought to perform, but which we cannot automatically perform because of contrary inclinations or moral weaknesses of one or another sort. That's the customary view in morality, and there often is a conflict in morality between inclination and obligation, and the will is not always, as Plato recognized in his moral psychology, the ally and executor of reason. And now, you might say, if you were inspired, you might say, let's live as though we were members of that community of rational intelligences. Let us be evidential saints. Such an attitude passed in James's time as the ethics of belief, according to which it was immoral to believe anything for which we had insufficient evidence, immoral to believe anything except what we ought to believe, immoral to believe anything other than what was obligatory. Now that's, of course, a very fundamentalistic view, which has an analog in systems of morality, where whatever is not obligatory is forbidden, something like you find in Calvin. It leaves out of account that vast body of things which neither are obligatory nor are forbidden, but which are merely permitted, where being permitted is defined, if you wish, in terms of not being forbidden and not being obligatory. With these, it's up to us whether or not we do them. And in the domain of belief, well, that body will comprise those propositions with respect to which the pure rational intelligences of my experiment of a moment ago would have to suspend judgment because it's not obligatory to believe them. The evidence would not cause assent for those propositions. And since with those creatures there are no causes which are not reasons, if they have no reason to believe, nothing can cause them to believe. And it's here that we differ, since with us causes often differ from reasons. And the question I put before us is this: have we a right to believe what we're caused to believe when we have, as defined in evidential terms, either no reason or no good reason for believing as we do, and where, unless we subscribe to that fundamentalist position that if a belief is not obligatory, it's forbidden, we have no obligation not to believe? Well, before sketching James's reply to that, which of course is, we do have such a right, let us pause for a moment to see whether, in saying this, James is saying that we're morally entitled to any belief we want to hold, so long as not believing is not obligatory. I want you to think for a moment of what the expression "the will to believe" means. I think, myself, that the conjunction of the two words will and belief will strike us as puzzling, not because there is the mere morality of belief which is an issue. The implication of joining these two terms is that we may believe what we will, so that what we believe is arbitrary. The Latin word for will is arbitrio. But there is, in addition, a psychological question of whether we can, as a psychological fact, believe as we will. And I don't believe we can. Consider any proposition which, just as a matter of fact, you don't at the moment believe. Now try to believe that proposition. Even if it's a proposition you might want to believe, in all likelihood, you can't get yourself to believe it by trying to believe it. It's like trying to forget something as a matter of decision. We do forget, but not by deciding to forget. And we do believe, but not by deciding to believe. Certain things would give us great comfort if we believed them. For example, that China is our great ally, that being burned with napalm confers bliss, that Santa Claus lives at the North Pole, waiting Christmas Eve to come bring presents to us. But you can't believe those things if you don't believe them, in part because you would, in the interests of consistency, have to give up many other beliefs in order to receive them. The whole world, I should suggest, would have to be very different for you in order that any of those beliefs could be held by you for true. I mean, your world would have to be a different world in order for you to hold those beliefs true. And the difficulty of deciding to believe these things would be matched by the difficulty of deciding not to believe those other things with which the desired proposition is so patently incompatible. Because beliefs are not isolated things. They form parts of systems of belief over which a measure of internal consistency is superinduced. And inserting a new but conflicting a belief into such a system is almost as complicated as, for example, putting a new organ into a body which will often blindly reject it because it's an alien intrusion. So it must seem, on the merest consideration of the matter, that we in fact have very little option over what we believe, that belief doesn't, so to speak, answer gladly to the summons of the will. And in dramatic cases, to accept a new proposition is to undergo at once a transformation of the world and a transformation of yourself. In other words, we sufficiently are identical with the beliefs that we hold, that when they change, we change. A change in beliefs can amount virtually to a change in identity. As, for example, think of the change undergone by Saul when he became St. Paul. And that entails, since we're constrained to believe the world to be the way we believe it to be, a change in the world as we've lived in it. St. Paul didn't merely think he was different when he got thrown from his horse on the road to Damascus. The world became different. That Christ should be a god rather than a minor political nuisance is not just another fact one happens to learn. It changes virtually the very notion of a fact. Now that's a dramatized case, but in minor ways I want to suggest it happens whenever our beliefs change. Obviously we have some control, but it's perhaps more conspicuous that our beliefs control us rather than the other way round. For with most of our beliefs, we can't help holding them. And I've been seeking to underscore this by stressing the impotency of the will with regard to belief. In this regard, then, believing is virtually a passion, and it's hardly to be wondered at that control of the beliefs should be treated in ancient moral literature as of a piece with the control of the passions. It's virtually as though it were not our task to acquire beliefs, but to control the beliefs which acquire us, so far as we're able to. Nothing could have been further from James's mind, then, than the idea that I may believe as I will, or that my beliefs should respond to the summons of my will. The expression, the will to believe, is a Germanism, what we would call today a drive, the way hunger and lust are drives. I say it's a Germanism because the will to X is a very German kind of expression. You find it in Nietzsche, for example, in the expression, the will to power. In Nietzsche's theory, we don't have, but we are will to power. We are energies directed outward, existing through our domination. And in an almost perfectly analogous sense, and we have to remember that James and Nietzsche were almost exact contemporaries, on James's view, it's not so much that we have, but that we are a set of beliefs, a complex of affirmations and of repudiations, and that's a view which, if correct, would explain the respect in which to change one's beliefs is in a measure to change at once oneself and one's world. Now, the characterization I've just given of will to believe will be as much the case with my community of pure rational intelligences as it is with us. Like us, they can't help believing as they do believe, except that they believe only what they ought to believe, providing that what one ought to believe is a function only of evidence and of differential evidential strengths. And now what we have to do is ask ourselves whether the state of being a pure rational intelligence caused by reasons, or what would be reasons, to believe as one does believe, is itself a desirable state. Ought we to be saints in the domain of belief? Ought we to aspire to that state if we wish to be morally unexceptionable believers? The pure rational intelligence I've defined in my discussion, not through the content of his beliefs, but on the basis of how they come to be held. Indeed, the pure rational intelligence must be indifferent to what he believes, and hence indifferent to how the world is, his concern being only whether the beliefs he holds, whatever their content, are held justifiably. As between competing propositions, he is, as such, indifferent. His will to believe goes into suspension when the evidence doesn't incline spontaneously in one rather than another direction. Only when the evidence inclines do his inclinations operate, and then only upon that proposition which is the correct proposition to favor. In that regard, he's very unlike us, for what characterizes us is not simply that we typically don't believe for reasons, but that we care about the content of our beliefs. And since we refer our beliefs to the world and not to ourselves as subjects, we care about the way the world is. It's that neutrality as regards different possible worlds which by contrast characterizes the pure rational intelligence. By not caring, he ipso facto acquiesces in whatever way the world should be. Now, James has, at this point, a most interesting proposal. Suppose that our wanting a certain proposition to be true should in some cases contribute to the truth of that proposition, so that if we didn't care, that would have meant that the proposition in question wouldn't have come true. Then, for that class of propositions, the very structure and content of the universe will depend upon our holding certain beliefs. And this is as much so for the pure rational intelligence as it is for us. By his not caring which way the world is, by his only caring that he not rationally believe the world to be some way in which it isn't, he by default contributes as much to shaping the universe by restraining himself from believing as we contribute to it by not refraining. For such propositions, and there are perhaps many, not to take a position is in effect to take a position. And if this is so, then every option regarding these is a forced option. James writes in his essay, The Sentiment of Rationality, as follows: belief, as measured by action, not only does, but must continually outstrip scientific evidence, and there is a certain class of truths of whose reality belief is a factor as well as a confessor. As regards this class of truths, faith is not only licit and pertinent, but essential and indispensable. The truths cannot become true until our faith has made them so. Now let me examine that view, which is the crux, perhaps, of James's position. When we care that a certain a certain belief be true, our care has the world as its object, not the fact that we happen to believe the proposition in question. I mean, typically, we don't care that we hold certain beliefs so much as we care that the beliefs we hold should be true. If we merely cared about holding the belief, then we all should be willing to undergo the following routines. Suppose science provided us with drugs which guaranteed that we should believe anything we'd like to believe. I mean, it wouldn't make the world different, it would just make us different. Perhaps I'd like to believe that I'm a millionaire, or I should like to believe that the war in Southeast Asia has been settled, or I'd like to believe that Brigitte Bardot is mad about me. I know that if I take these drugs, I'll sincerely believe these propositions, and I'll see the world through the lenses of those beliefs. Think how comfortable one would feel holding those beliefs. But comfort notwithstanding, we could not, I think, take the drug. For our concern is not to be comfortable with the beliefs we hold, but comfortable only that the beliefs we hold are true. That's why the pure rational intelligence remains insofar a paradigm for the ethics of belief. His concern is not in the content of what he believes, but only in the likelihood of what he believes being true, and hence that the world should be as little different from his representation of it as evidence will permit. So, when we believe a proposition true, we cannot will to believe differently than we do, for that would be to change the very concept of belief. Belief would become a mere sedative. And in some measure, that explains our revulsion against such things as brainwashing, where a man is caused to believe what isn't so and what before he didn't believe was so. It's the horror as well of what we read in 1984, where the hero's will is broken and swings pointlessly like an abandoned gate. Well, one might say, in the face of those considerations, how does caring enter one way or another in the morality of belief? What does it matter whether we care or not? True, I care that the members of my family should not be ill, but my caring doesn't affect the truth of my belief. Now, these fresh considerations cast some initial doubt upon James's theory that belief is a factor as well as a confessor. Let me show how. Suppose I believe it's snowing out now. Then I must refer that belief to the world. And so to believe that it's snowing out is to believe that it's true that it's snowing out. But that means I must regard its snowing out as a fait accompli. And insofar as I don't regard it as a fait accompli, I don't believe that the proposition is true. But so far as I don't believe it true, I don't believe it, period. Now, if it is a fait accompli, an accomplished fact, something that's really there, it follows that I can, and no one can, do anything about it. For to suppose something could be done about it is at once to suppose it's not a fait accompli. And this, as I've argued, entails that I can't hold the corresponding belief. So, to believe a proposition is to believe that nothing can be done regarding that which makes it true, and to believe that something can be done regarding what makes it true is not to believe the proposition in question. So, we must ask, how could James consistently assert that the belief contributes to making the proposition true? For he who believes that the proposition is true is the last person in the world to take any steps towards making it true, it being a fait accompli in his mind. If anything, the belief that it's true would serve to inhibit any steps being taken with regard to that proposition on the part of him who holds the belief. So, James's theory, by that argument, seems just false. And similarly, the concept of care no longer seems operative. I may care a great deal that there's a certain fait accompli. But if I'm a rational being, I know that if it's a fait accompli, there's nothing I can do about it. It's passed outside my power. I have no recourse save to accept it, to stand by, if you wish, in stoic resolution. For what's the good of my care any longer? The time for caring, being useful, is past when that which I care about is a fait accompli. So James's positive thinking, his appeal to the factors of self-confidence, seem, in the light of those logical considerations, to be slightly dated, slightly heroic, quite irrelevant postures. Nevertheless, the argument I've just presented holds, I believe, just what we need in order to establish James's position. I can believe that what I do makes a difference to the world only if I believe that the world itself is not a fait accompli. And if I believe it is a fait accompli, then I am constrained to believe that I am impotent to change the face of the world. So, if I believe that I'm not impotent to change the face of the world, then I must also believe that the world is not completely a fait accompli. Now, of course, I should suppose the world not to be a fait accompli and still think I'm impotent to change it, but let's merely concentrate on the other case. If I believe I'm not impotent to alter the world, I must regard the world as alterable and hence not a fait accompli, and hence it's open as to whether some propositions are false or true. Now, consider these two propositions. First, the world is not a fait accompli. And secondly, we make a difference to how the world is. Regarding these two propositions, what is the pure rational intelligence to decide? Let's remember that we're dealing here with the ancient problem of the freedom of the will and ultimately the problem of fate and of logical determinism. I believe it's not an inconsidered answer to our question regarding those two propositions that the evidence cannot incline rationally in one direction or another. For it must by now be clear that any evidence in support of one side in that ancient controversy can be matched by equally compelling evidence for the other side, and that every argument on the one side has equally compelling arguments on the other. So, the pure rational intelligence is obliged to be neutral. In being neutral, however, it is as if he acquiesced in the proposition that the universe is closed and that we are impotent to alter it. To be agnostic is, after all, pragmatically speaking, to be fatalistic. So this is a forced option. What then if I believe those two propositions? These can't be rational beliefs, as rationality has been defined in my discussion tonight. But if I believe that the universe is not a fait accompli, I in effect act as though it's a fait accompli that the universe is open. And if I believe that it's similarly a fait accompli, it's my nature, that I'm not impotent to change the face of nature, then I can't shrug off my nature, which is the nature of a doer and of a changer, of a free agent, and of a modifier of the world. And I, in effect, live as a free agent in an open world. Perhaps these are illusions. If they are, for the very reason that the beliefs are not rational, I can't know. But just because it's not a rational belief, it's open to me to believe if I do believe, and in believing as I do, I may be making a difference in the world, and the world may be, in consequence of my actions, a very different world than it would have been had I been a mere externally disinterested, rational intelligence. So the difference, if it is a difference, is a momentous difference. Your first free act, James once told a group of students, should be to believe in the freedom of the will. Let me sketch at this point three positions. One is the position of the pure rational intelligence. He is, in effect, a disinterested contemplator of a world he has no concern to modify, but only a concern to understand. He has a position which is outside the world. In contrast, there is a fatalist. He is, in effect, inside the world, a product and passive transmitter of the sweep of causal forces. He is impotent, he believes, to change the order in which he's located, and his believing he cannot act differentially comes to just the same thing as the disinterested outsider's program of mere contemplation. It little matters in the end, then, whether we are outside or inside the world. The third position is James's position. It's the view that we are distinctive through being at once within and without the world, knowers and changers, factors as well as confessors. In order that the world itself should house such complex creatures as we, it in turn must have certain traits. It can't be a fait accompli, for one thing, and it must make a difference to how it is to be accompli, that we should be in it, and how it's to come out in turn must depend upon us, upon what we believe, and upon how we feel. How much it is to depend upon us depends, in the end, upon the degree to which the world is open and upon our powers to frame it in congruity with our wishes. But however limited the openness of the world and the powers of men to modify it may be, still it may make a difference that we should believe it open and believe ourselves capable within those limits of causing it to change. Only if it is closed and we powerless would our beliefs make no difference. Yet they would even so make a difference to us. And if they do, and the beliefs are ours, then James has argued that we have a right to them. And however the world itself might be, the way we shall live in it will be a function of how we believe. To live in the world as though it were open and we amongst its shapers is intoxicating when we ponder the alternatives. And who is to say that we are so little a part of the world that the difference to us is not, after all, a difference in the way the world is? As a philosopher, James responded to the analytical demands which this view imposed. He worked out, in his charming way, strikingly original views about meaning, about truth, about reality, about religion. Philosophy is a systematic enterprise. No philosopher can be great who's not touched all bases. However impulsive one is as a writer and a thinker, a philosophical position must be established around 4 or 5 key and central questions, on each of which James said something not merely fresh, but fresh because the system which was demanding their articulation was a fresh system of thought. It's difficult to think of another system which bears so nakedly and clear the will to believe of its inventor. And James himself would have said, philosophy itself is nothing but will to believe. Thank you.